Hey, it's me again. Have you ever looked around on Google Earth, scanning the globe for anything interesting? Of course you have. Frankly, if you're watching this, I imagine you do this quite regularly. And I'm close to certain that during these digital explorations of yours, this place has caught your eye. And, I imagine, you've probably zoomed in on it as well, as it's a place that quite immediately catches your attention. Sitting in the southern Indian Ocean, miles away from any other land, are these islands, the Kerguelen Islands. It's an archipelago that is dominated by one major island, Grande Terre, beside which are a few smaller islands, only about 300 of them. Yes, this place is French. Apart from the fact that it's French, this place has a fairly lengthy history of whaling, sealing, shipwrecks. The islands are also volcanic, they're very isolated, and they're cold. So we're really covering new ground here with this video. If all this sounds interesting to you, stick around as I present to you the history and the geography of the Kerguelen Islands. The first record of the island is on a French map made in 1754 by cartographer Philippe Bouache. On the map, it is known by another name, Ile de Nachtegaal. The name is a possible reference to the ship of explorer Abel Tasman, but it's strange to find this recorded on his map, seeing as the Kerguelen Islands were not officially discovered until 20 years later in 1772. There seems no concrete evidence as to how the island came onto the map without anyone seemingly ever having been there, but then again, not all records of those times have survived, and not everything was always accurately recorded, so we can't say for sure what year the islands were first spotted. Around this time, many nations, including the French, were in search of the rumored southern continent, Terra Australis. Essentially, they were looking for Antarctica, not knowing yet of its existence. The belief in those days was that all the land in the northern hemisphere must be equaled in the southern hemisphere. When European nations began exploring the southern hemisphere, they soon realized what we know now, that there's not much land there. Nonetheless, explorers had accepted the theory as a fact, and therefore they believed they simply just hadn't found it yet. The French, being on board with this theory, dispatched ships to the southern oceans to find the secret continent. Their third expedition, consisting of two flights, the Fortune and the Gros Ventre, commanded by this guy, would discover the islands, which are now known by his name, Kerguelen, and return to the French-controlled Mauritius to report their findings. Here he made his report to the king. In it he wrote of what he had found. Kerguelen was either convinced to have actually found Terra Australis, or more likely he lied about having found it, as in his report he wrote of the great importance of his find. This report awarded Kerguelen the resources for another expedition to the islands to further explore it. During this second visit, it became undeniable that the islands were utterly useless, and not the fabled Terra Australis. The thing is, in some way Kerguelen did discover a hidden continent, just not the one he was looking for. Hidden beneath the waves of the southern Indian Ocean lies the Kerguelen Plateau, a microcontinent the size of about a third of Australia that sank into the ocean about 20 million years ago. The Kerguelen archipelago is just the highest point of this continent, a point that had not yet been submerged. The Gallieni Massif dominates Kerguelen, from which land almost appears to flow outwards. On top of the mountain range sits a large ice cap. Glaciation causes the depression and tipping phenomena which creates the gulfs at the north and east of the archipelago, and a plain in the eastern Courbet Peninsula. Further glacial erosion has caused the formation of various fjords found all over the archipelago. The highest point is found to the south. Mount Ross sits at 1850 meters above sea level. An ultra-prominent peak, this stratovolcano is a highly identifiable landmark of the main island. The Kerguelen Plateau is also a volcanic hotspot, hence a large amount of the islands consisting of basalt flows. Despite all this, Mount Ross has not erupted in recorded history. In 1776, more would become known about the islands when they were visited by a relatively unknown and obscure British explorer, a fellow went by the name James Cook. Cook investigated several parts of the island and spent his Christmas in what is now referred to as Christmas Harbor. Near Christmas Harbor could be found a natural arch sticking out from the sea. This became quite an iconic landmark of the islands early on. Unfortunately, this arch has since collapsed somewhere at the start of the 20th century. At Kerguelen, one thing became abundantly clear to Cook, and that was the lack of wood. Not just the lack of trees, but also a lack of driftwood on the beach. Something that is a common occurrence even in islands high up in the Arctic, which speaks to the isolation of Kerguelen and the lack of ocean currents able to transport driftwood to the island. Still, the currents would bring the odd ship to Kerguelen, and this is where I introduced John Nunn. John was a man of the sea in pretty much every regard. Born into a family of an English fisherman, he would spend his entire young life working various jobs on the water. At the age of 22, he would join up with a whaling party headed for the Southern Ocean. The ship, named the Royal Sovereign, would set sail in 1825 on their long journey south. Kerguelen was already known as a good hunting ground for seals, specifically the elephant seal, and also a good location for hunting whales. And for this reason, the Royal Sovereign chose to hunt there. John and 3 other sailors would set off from the main ship for an excursion to the north of Grande Terre, around the region of Christmas Harbour. Their shallop, named the Favourite, would spring a leak, forcing the crew to abandon ship. Because the leak was not noticed in time and the cause not readily apparent, the crew had little time until they were forced to abandon ship and go ashore, not able to take many provisions with them. John's party was not the only expedition group, and so they were hoping to run into some of their other sailors while they were stranded. Fortunately for them, the crew would come upon a wrecked shallop on the beach named the Loon, which had been abandoned by a previous visitor to the island. In it, the crew would take shelter for a few days, waiting for rescue as they struggled to stay warm. They would occasionally fire a musket into the air, hoping to attract attention as the noise echoed in the bay. Kerguelen, as you may now have realized, is not the friendliest climate to humans. Cold, damp, and barren. Kerguelen had already gotten the nickname Desolation Islands through the earlier explorations by James Cook. John would write about the unspeakable cold they had to endure while waiting. They knew that the Royal Sovereign was anchored on the south end of Grande Terre, at Greenland Bay. Walking back was deemed infeasible due to the terrain and the harsh weather. This weather is caused by the moist winds coming into contact with the lofty snow-capped mountains of Kerguelen, which act as a sort of large refrigerator and cause the atmosphere to be filled with heavy clouds which would condense into rain or snow. From the climate of this island being exceedingly severe, damp and unsettled, we frequently suffered much. The storms of wind, rain and snow would suddenly come upon us and continue for days or weeks together. After months went by, it became clear that no help was coming, and in reality the Royal Sovereign had already left, believing the 4 of them to be dead. The possibility was accepted by John's party, and so they worked on making the Loon seaworthy. They succeeded with this, and successfully made their way to the Greenland Bay, where they found no one. They would continue and circumnavigate Grande Terre until finally settling at what they referred to as Long Point. Here they would establish their main shelter, which they named Hope Cottage. Survival was not easy. The crew had to turn to hunting when their supplies ran low, primarily seals, penguins, and various other birds, and also their eggs. Penguins were the easiest to catch as they were docile, and the crew learned to imitate the calls of them to which penguins would approach them. While penguins were the easiest to catch, seals were the most valuable as their blubber was rendered into oil, which they could burn to keep themselves warm. Over time, the seals and penguins became more alert, and catching them became increasingly difficult. Seasonal birds would also begin their migration, and so the food supply diminished. Starvation and scurvy would begin to set in. At certain points, the crew was so hungry they would be reduced to eating seal skins and the soles of their boots. To combat scurvy, the crew would harvest one of the few plants growing on the island. This is what is known as the Kerguelen cabbage. Not by any means the tastiest or most nutritious vegetable, it does contain a highly pungent essential oil, which is rich in vitamin C. Hence, this plant would be added as a supplement to their meals. The crew kept busy and spent their time hunting, exploring, and scanning the horizon, with not much hope of rescue. The island was a prison without walls, and the world beyond had forgotten them. It was not until 1827, 2 years after arriving on Kerguelen, that the 4 were discovered by an American sealing ship operating in the area. Astonishingly, all 4 would make it out alive, and John would go on to write a book describing his experiences and the 2 years the Kerguelen had cost him. This would be some of the first detailed insights onto the island, but it wasn't until the Ross expedition of 1840 that the islands were finally properly surveyed and mapped. Ross would spend 68 days exploring the islands and carrying out meteorological, oceanographic, hydrographic, and biological studies on the island. The islands became even more scientifically important in the 1870s when American, British, and German scientists were sent to the islands to observe the transit of Venus. The islands would also start getting used as a base for expeditions to Antarctica and also be investigated for the possibility of coal mining, but this ended up being economically infeasible. What was economical was whaling, and Kerguelen would see much more traffic from whalers and sealers in the second half of the 19th century, which also resulted in the first person to be born south of the Antarctic convergence occurring on the islands. In 1893, the French would increase their presence on the islands, fearing that other colonial powers, specifically the Germans, may attempt to secure it for themselves. After having militarily secured the islands, the French initiated plans to permanently populate them as well, which included the introduction of a special breed of sheep, the Bizet sheep, which could be relied on as a food source. Unfortunately, attempted habitation was difficult, and the attempt to introduce sheep was a folly, as they would simply freeze to death in the cold climate of Kerguelen. The ambitions of humans would have to wait, as nature had an indifference to their stay, something John Nunn had already learned for himself. Throughout the early 1900s, the islands would not have a population that would stay for longer than a few years. It wasn't until the 1950s that the islands would finally have a permanent population at the settlement port-aux-francaise. At this time, currently about 50 to 120 people live here depending on the season. The inhabitants of Port-aux-Francaise are primarily researchers and military personnel. Port-aux-Francaise was the site of a seismic station used during the Cold War to monitor nuclear testing. It was also the site of launching sounding rockets into the atmosphere to collect meteorological data and study the upper atmosphere. They don't have an airstrip, even though there had been attempts to create one, and so the only way to reach this place is by a supply vessel which arrives at the island roughly every 3 months. The reason it is visited so infrequently is entirely due to the isolation of Kerguelen. A round trip with a modern ship takes about a month, which makes you wonder how it's possible that these islands have been of such big interest. It wasn't just for scientific reasons, as the islands had a certain allure which has resulted in several novels inspired by the islands. Even John, who must have hated this place when he was stuck there, later on writes fondly of the islands and remained deeply interested in them. And now 200 years after his stay, I'm talking about them. I'm sure he's proud, as now I have 300 more islands to add to my list.